The paintings of the Austrian Expressionist Egon Schiele are not to everyone's liking. Pale, unhealthy skin tones, emaciated bodies in strange, distorted postures. Lots of flesh, but not all of it beautiful. His images aren't always easy to look at, but they're certainly powerful. Welcome to Insane History. I'm Graeme Yorston, and today I'm exploring the unsettling world of Egon Schiele. In his short life, he produced over 200 paintings and thousands of drawings and other works, many of them portraits. But many of these are in bizarre, twisted poses, and I wanted to find out why. Egon Schiele was born in 1890 in Tulln, a small provincial town 25 miles from Vienna, the capital of the soon-to-implode Austro-Hungarian Empire. His father, Adolf, was the railway station master. His mother, Marie, the daughter of a building contractor from the picturesque Bohemian town of Český Krumlov, known as Krumlau in German. From the very start, the marriage was troubled. Adolf was ejected from the marital bed by his nervous 17-year-old bride on their wedding night and sought solace at a local brothel, where, along with whatever else he got for his gulden, he contracted syphilis. This he passed on to his wife, and she in turn to some of her children. She had several stillborn sons and miscarriages, and her first live-born child, Elvira, died at the age of 10 from meningitis. The next was Melanie, who lived into her 80s. Then came Egon, and 4 years later Gertrude, or Gertie, with whom he would have a close but rather complicated relationship. As the only boy, there were high expectations for Egon. Both grandfathers had been railway engineers, and his uncle too was a railway inspector, so naturally Egon was expected to follow in their footsteps. For a while it looked promising. The family lived over the station, where Egon would spend hours watching, sketching and recording the arrivals and departures of the various trains. But it soon became clear that it was the sketching rather than the trains he loved most. His mother wrote a short biography of her son in 1927, in which she recalled it had been her most ardent wish for him to become an engineer, not waste his time with his constant drawing. She was completely overwhelmed by the demands of family life, writing,
"I suffer. I did not deserve this. Because of the children, I'm forced to lead such a miserable life. I need somebody who will take care of me."
One time she was so enraged at Egon for using up an entire sketch pad in one day, she threw his drawings into the fire. But drawing is what Egon did. He was quiet and introverted and struggled to make friends at school. At home, when he wasn't drawing, he would play with Gertie, and they would spend hours watching the family hens together, keeping detailed records of their breeding habits. Later, he would have confused sexual feelings for Gertie, and this unhealthy interest didn't go unnoticed by his parents. And one time when they were locked in his room together, his father broke down the door, only to find them innocently developing film negatives. Tulln had no secondary school, so at the age of 11 he was sent to the nearby town of Krems, where he boarded with a rather stern widow who rarely permitted him to leave the house. Here too he was regarded as a strange boy, shy and academically undistinguished, except in drawing and athletics. And he was so unhappy away from home that his parents brought him back after 6 months and arranged a private tutor. At 12 he was sent to the gymnasium in Klosterneuburg, a town 12 miles to the east. But again he was unhappy at boarding with strangers, and his academic work did not improve. By now Egon knew he wanted to be an artist, and it was clear he had ability. But his family was unwilling, or unable, to acknowledge this. They had bigger problems to deal with. His father was now seriously mentally ill as a result of the syphilis bacterium ravaging his brain. With Adolf unable to work, the family finances were put under severe strain. They could not remain in the station house and moved to Klosterneuburg. But Adolf's increasingly bizarre behaviour meant the family had to keep moving home and finding ways of coping with his illness. His grandiose delusions about imaginary railway inspectors and other dignitaries he insisted were coming for dinner. For the most part, the family tried to humour him and entertained the invisible guests as if they were real. But the strain of not knowing what to say or how to react to his outbursts took its toll. Egon's school grades suffered, and he was moved down to be taught with boys 2 years younger. In 1904, the family spent the summer in his mother's hometown. It made a big impression on the 14-year-old Egon, visually, but also because his father made an attempt on his life. Although thwarted, he died just a few months later, the family incorrectly reporting the date of his death as January 1st, 1905, to earn an extra year's pension. And at this point his uncle, Leopold Cichacek, was appointed as his guardian. At school, Egon's art teacher, Ludwig Strauch, recognised and encouraged his artistic talent, but his other teachers thought he was disruptive, as he was always drawing in class. And after failing his exams, the family was asked to remove him from the gymnasium. A sketchbook from this period recently resurfaced, with pictures of a teacher's daughter who lived next door, his first love, to whom he penned some ardent teenage love letters and poems. With the encouragement of his teacher, and very much against the advice of his uncle, he sat and passed the exacting entrance exam for the Akademie der Bildenden Künste in Vienna, the Academy of Fine Arts, where just about every famous Austrian artist had studied. The same institution, incidentally, that rejected another Austrian artist a year later, Adolf Hitler. His mother and 2 sisters moved to Vienna to be with him, and he also came under the closer scrutiny of his uncle Leopold. At 16, he was the youngest student at the academy, and his shyness meant that he was particularly young for his age. But this soon changed. Around this time, he took his 12-year-old sister Gertie by train to Trieste without permission and spent a night in a hotel room with her. It's not clear what happened on that occasion, but Trieste is where his parents went on honeymoon, and Gertie would later pose naked for him as a model, and he would write about how painful he found his emerging sexual feelings. Have adults forgotten how they themselves were incited and aroused by sex impulses as children? Have they forgotten the frightful passion burned and tortured them while they were still children? I have not forgotten, for I suffered excruciatingly from it. All very Freudian. Not surprisingly, as this was precisely the era that Freud, living just a couple of miles away, was becoming known for what were then radical and highly controversial theories about the human mind. His work stimulated heated debate amongst artists and intellectuals of every discipline, and outrage amongst the more conservative elements in society, who dubbed him the Viennese libertine and accused him of encouraging perversity and illegitimacy. In 1908, his old teacher Ludwig Strauch included some of his works in a small exhibition in Klosterneuburg, and his drawings caught the eye of Heinrich Benesch, the chief inspector of Austria's railways, who, despite his modest means, would become one of Schiele's most loyal supporters, and pass on his enthusiasm to his son Otto, who would become an art historian and a long-serving director of the Albertina Museum, one of the best places to see the artist's work today. By now his uncle was more supportive. He would often pick him up and have lunch with him, and pay for his art supplies, and he helped him set up his first studio. One of his favourite haunts was the Café Sperl, just around the corner from the academy, still doing business over 100 years later. Their bond was close enough for Schiele to spend his summer holidays with him, but Leopold felt that Egon did not always show him the proper respect, and there was often friction between them, especially as he began to grow in confidence. Eventually, Schieler's bohemian attitudes led to Leopold refusing to be his guardian any longer. Some of his teachers at the academy also felt he was getting a bit too big for his boots. After completing the introductory curriculum by sticking to conventional forms, he advanced to the painting class of Christian Griepenkerl, a notoriously strict tutor and extremely conservative painter. Schiele didn't like him, and Griepenkerl didn't like Schiele or his opinions, saying, "You have been shit into my class by the devil." The result was that he skipped a lot of classes and learned what he could from others. By then, he'd already met Gustav Klimt, the leading light of the Vienna art scene, who was a generous mentor of younger artists. When Schiele showed his portfolio to Klimt and asked whether he had talent, Klimt replied, "Yes, much. Too much." Klimt took a particular interest in Schiele, buying his drawings, arranging models for him, and introducing him to potential patrons. He also introduced Schiele to the Wiener Werkstätte, the arts and crafts workshop that produced the furniture, fabrics, teapots and posters that were meant to accompany the paintings within the philosophy of Gesamtkunstwerk, total art, of the Vienna Secession, the union of Austrian artists that had formed a decade earlier and which had a huge influence on modern art in Austria and internationally. Schiele's early works from this period show the clear influence of Klimt and other Jugendstil artists, but as he began to find his own style, the Klimtian curves are replaced by Schiele's sharper lines, dramatic angles and stark backgrounds. His romantic hero self-portraits give way to bleak, unflattering, emaciated and exposed portrayals as he attempts to create a distinct vision of himself as an artist. In 1909, Schiele and several classmates protested against the Academy's conservative academic regime by issuing a formal letter of complaint, claiming that their creativity was being stifled and Austria's cultural advancement was being held back, which resulted in their immediate expulsion. So he founded the Neukunstgruppe, the New Art Group, with other dissatisfied students, including Anton Peschke, who would later marry his sister Gerti, and they had their first exhibition at the prestigious Pisco Gallery. Shortly after this, Klimt invited him to exhibit in the 1909 Vienna International Art Show, or Kunstschau, alongside Henri Matisse, Vincent van Gogh and Edvard Munch. Quite an honour for an artist not yet out of his teens. Now freed from the shackles of the Academy's conservatism, Schiele's journey to find his self-identity started to gather momentum. The elegant and gently erotic Jugendstil Eden was left behind as he moved towards a more dystopian landscape. Using the stylistic devices of Expressionism, he began to present the world as he saw it and felt it, distorting and exaggerating physical reality to get to his raw emotional experience of existence. And what he increasingly focused on trying to express in his new way was the human body, but in awkward, twisted, contorted postures, viewed from unusual angles with sallow, unhealthy-looking skin, which give the impression that the subjects are being examined under a harsh light by some kind of humourless government inspector, or are about to be dissected by a maniacal anatomist. Many of these paintings are missing body parts or have a gender-ambiguous quality to them that has sparked endless speculation from psychoanalysts about Schiele's mental life. One theory is that he was mirroring the uncertain relationship he had with his mother, testing whether his spectators will still love him, even if he reveals the darkest side of his nature. He shows himself to be utterly alone and completely exposed, and he invites rejection. If you've seen any of my other videos, you'll probably know that I'm not a big fan of psychoanalytic interpretations, and for me, this doesn't really add an awful lot to our understanding. When Schiele was asked why he drew such ugly representations of himself, he said he had made the pictures horrible, not because he wanted to, or because he wanted to shock the comfortable bourgeois mentality, but because he had to portray the ghosts of his yearning. He was modern enough not to feel ashamed about normal sexual feelings, so I wonder if he is referring to his feelings for his sister Gertie here. We know she was posing for him at this time, naked, and that he sometimes overpainted a different face to save her blushes, but some of them are pretty explicit. Another theory is that the misshapen, twisted bodies are portrayals of some kind of neurological condition. There is no evidence that Schiele himself had a neurological disorder, but he often posed for photographs in the same awkward, uncomfortable-looking positions as his paintings. So if he was trying to portray dystonias, where did the idea come from? One suggestion is that he saw the images of patients with mental illness and the neurological conditions that had been published in the photographic iconography of the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris, a 3-volume textbook published in 1877 by what was then the world's leading research centre for neurology and psychiatry, led by Jean-Martin Charcot. Illustrated by high-quality photographic plates, the books were intended as a pictorial reference for clinicians, but the aesthetic and expressive qualities of many of the images were soon recognised by artists. A few years later, a bi-monthly medical journal edited by Gilles de la Tourette, describing and illustrating the latest cases from the Salpêtrière, also appeared, the new iconography, which included studies of people with physical malformations and noticeably more pictures of male patients, as it began to be recognised that hysteria wasn't just for women. And Vienna was buzzing with talk about mental science. In 1907, an impressive new psychiatric hospital had opened, the Steinhof, partly designed by leading Jugendstil architect Otto Wagner. And of course, the city was the epicentre of the new way of thinking about human behaviour, psychoanalysis. We know that a close friend, Erwin Orsen, a member of the New Art Group, and someone Schiele sometimes shared studio space with, was asked to draw some of the patients at Steinhof to illustrate a talk by a Dr. Kronfeld on pathological expression in portraiture. And there are references to Dr. Kronfeld in Schiele's diary, so it seems likely that he would have had access to some or all of the iconography images. Take, for example, this case of macrodactyly, or abnormally enlarged fingers, which shows an uncanny resemblance to the hands in several of Schiele's paintings. With the searingly intense symphonies of Gustav Mahler echoing in the concert halls, and people queuing up to watch the controversial plays of Arthur Schnitzler, with their frank and very modern portrayals of sexuality, Vienna was ready for the provocative art of Egon Schiele. He was aided in these early years by the influential art critic Arthur Rössler, who helped build Schiele's reputation and secure him numerous sales and commissions. Schiele's work tapped into the zeitgeist, and demand for new art that was a bit different, a bit challenging, a bit angsty was high. But he continued to live an isolated and very humble, almost poverty-stricken existence. And naturally, not everyone in Vienna liked his work. The city was both a vibrant, multi-ethnic melting pot of artistic ideas and a deeply conservative prop for an empire that was living on borrowed time. And many of those in polite circles found the explicitness of his works disturbing. His friend Heinrich Benesch warned him not to flaunt his more provocative works, but Schiele didn't want to hear it. It wasn't just Vienna that was interested in the new enfant terrible of the art world. His works were shown in Prague, Cologne, Budapest, and alongside Kandinsky and the Blue Rider artists in Munich. In 1911, Schiele met the 17-year-old Vally Neutzel. It is often claimed that she had modelled for Gustav Klimt, and may even have been one of his many lovers, but there is no evidence for this, and there are no Klimt paintings of her. Whatever the circumstances of their meeting, Valley and Schiele soon became lovers, and she moved in with him and served as a model for some of his most famous paintings, including Valley Neutzel in black stockings and Valley in red blouse with raised knees. Then some kind of crisis occurred. There were rumours of a pregnancy in one of his other models, and the couple decided to move to Český Krumlov, the birthplace of Schiele's mother. But a small, traditional town was no place for a trailblazer of modern art, and despite his family's connections, they were hounded out of the town by the burghers, who disapproved of their lifestyle and were suspicious of him using local girls as models. They then moved to Neulengbach, another small town 20 miles west of Vienna. Renting a cottage on the edge of town, away from prying eyes, Egon and Valley were happy, but oblivious to the wagging tongues in the town. Things got worse when his studio became a gathering place for Neulengbach's ne'er-do-wells and feral children, and this did not go down well with the local inhabitants. And in April 1912, he was arrested on charges of abducting and seducing a 13-year-old girl. When the police came to arrest him, they seized more than 100 drawings, which they considered obscene, and he was imprisoned while awaiting trial. It was a serious charge, and if convicted, he would have been disgraced and surgically castrated. Valley supported him through this period of anguish and brought him in food, and when his case appeared in court, the charges of seduction were dropped. But he was found guilty of exhibiting inappropriate drawings in a place accessible to children, and the judge symbolically burned one of the offending works in front of his eyes. He was given an additional 3 days on top of the 21 he had already spent in custody, and then he was out, incensed at what he regarded as unreasonable and unsanctioned censorship, but free and with his anatomy intact. He was chastened by the experience and the press coverage that followed, and tried to live a reclusive life as much as possible. And although he continued to paint nudes, he moved away from the graphic detail of his earlier works. Klimt stood by him, and with his support, Schiele was able to get back onto his feet despite the bad publicity. Klimt put him in touch with important collectors and gallery owners, and he was soon showing his work again and getting commissions. An exhibition organised by the Hagenbund group of artists in Vienna showed 7 oil paintings, including the Hermits, and he was able to rent a new studio in the upmarket Hietzing district, close to Schönbrunn Palace and Klimt's studio. In 1913, the more traditional Association of Austrian Artists, whose president was now Gustav Klimt, made him a member, and he had several exhibitions in Austria and Germany, including his first solo exhibition at the Hans Goltz Gallery in Munich. As well as his more famous paintings and drawings, he also made some sculptures and wrote poetry, some of which were published in the weekly journal Die Fackel, The Torch, and he contributed several art theory papers to the journal Die Aktion, The Action, in Berlin. Slowly, his self-confidence returned. Commissions were coming in, and he adopted a slightly safer, less radical approach to his work. He was still with Valley, but he began to notice 2 sisters who lived with their parents across the street from his studio, Edith and Adela Harms. Very nice, very proper, and very middle class. But in June 1914, the heir presumptive to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was shot by a Serbian nationalist in Sarajevo, in the empire's most recent territorial acquisition, Bosnia and Herzegovina. A month later, Europe was at war. Fighting campaigns against the Russians in the east, Serbia in the south, and Italy in the Alps, the empire needed men. 3 million were eventually called up, but for the first year, no papers arrived for Egon Schiele. In 1915, seeking to adopt a more socially acceptable lifestyle, he decided to marry Edith, the younger of the 2 Harms girls. When he explained to Valley that he would still like to spend a few weeks a year with her as well, she was understandably less than enthusiastic, walking out and volunteering as an auxiliary nurse for military hospitals. She was posted to Dalmatia, where she died of scarlet fever 2 years later on Christmas Day 1917. One of his most heartfelt paintings, Death and the Maiden, reflects his sense of loss and perhaps regret at his decision to give up Valley. It is also the title of a great movie about Schiele's complicated love life. The older sister, Adela, also posed for Schiele, and it was rumoured she may also have shared his bed at times. And one of his most famous paintings is of Adela, not Edith. Back in Vienna, after initial opposition from her parents, Schiele married Edith in June 1915. 3 days later, he was ordered to report for military service. He was initially posted to Prague, and his new bride came with him and stayed in a hotel, and they were allowed to see each other occasionally. He was treated well by his commanding officers, who respected his artistic talents. Because of his weak heart and clear handwriting, Schiele was given a job as a clerk in a prisoner of war camp near the town of Mühling, 70 miles west of Vienna. There he was allowed to draw and paint imprisoned Russian soldiers. He was even given a disused storeroom to use as a studio, and was put in charge of the food stores in the camp, so he and Edith were able to have a little more than their rations permitted. He was never involved in any fighting at the front, and in January 1918 Schiele was transferred to a military supply depot in Vienna, and his commanding officer kept his duties light and gave him plenty of time off. So in spite of all the wartime restrictions, he was able to continue his artistic activities and produce dozens of drawings and paintings in a final flurry of creative activity. Edith was kept busy dealing with all the correspondence, setting up successful exhibitions in Berlin, Zurich, Prague and Dresden, and arranging sittings for portraits. Around this time he began introducing themes of motherhood and family into his work, with Edith acting as the model for most of the female figures, which became a little healthier looking and fuller in figure. Also in January 1918, his loyal friend and mentor Gustav Klimt suffered a stroke, which left him paralysed on his right side, and after developing pneumonia, he quietly passed away a month later. When the national mourning at his death had subsided, it was widely acknowledged that Schiele was now Austria's leading artist. And his new stature was confirmed by a sold-out exhibition at the Vienna Secession in March. Schiele had 50 works on show and was given pride of place in the main hall. He also designed the poster for the exhibition, reminiscent of the Last Supper, but an earlier version was simply called The Friends, and the later version, with the empty chair, possibly represents his now absent friend, Klimt. The show was a personal triumph. The prices for his works increased, and he was given several portrait commissions. In April, he was transferred to the Army Museum, where he was given an even freer rein to pursue his artistic activities. With money from sales and commissions rolling in, he was able to rent a larger studio, but the bigger space was difficult to heat, and by the autumn, in the closing months of the war, Vienna had serious shortages of food and fuel. 1918 had seen millions of people in Europe die from the Spanish flu pandemic, and in September the deadly second wave reached Vienna. Unlike the first wave, this variant had a much higher death rate in young people. And in October, Edith, who was 6 months pregnant, became ill. 3 weeks later, she died. Schiele drew a few final sketches of her on her sickbed, his last works, as by now he too was ill. And just 3 days later, he succumbed. He was 28 years old. His brother-in-law recalled his last words as "Mother, give me air," an unrequited cry for his mother's love and affection one last time. One can only wonder how his work might have developed if he had lived as long as Picasso, 91, or his fellow Austrian, Oskar Kokoschka, who made it to 93. Would he have become more radical or less radical? And how would he have negotiated the incorporation of Austria into the Third Reich? He had little respect for authority, and the Nazis really didn't like his work, deeming it to be degenerate and consigning it to the flames, much as his parents and the disapproving judge had done years before. They objected to his raw depictions of sexuality. Artists have been painting nudes to titillate wealthy patrons since the Renaissance, of course, but Schiele's nudes are different. Some people describe them as erotic. Some read into them what they imagine to have been his feelings of disgust at his own and others' sexuality. Still others interpret them as homoerotic. I have to say that for me, as a doctor, as someone who spent his 19th year in the dissecting room, there seems to be a cold, clinical quality to some of them. Even the colours are more reminiscent of the mortuary slab than the bedroom. I'm sure this probably says more about me than about Schiele. But that's surely the point of great art. It's rich and complex and invites 100 interpretations, all of which, give or take a few, are equally valid. He did paint a lot of nudes, and some are quite explicit. But he was one of the first artists to portray women enjoying their own bodies, rather than just displaying them for the pleasure of others. And I don't agree with those who condemn his work as degrading to women and demand he should be cancelled. There is, however, the difficult issue of his depictions of children. There aren't many, and most of them appear innocent enough, but there are some with no clothes on, which, although they are not overtly sexual, you can understand why the townsfolk of Český Krumlov and Neulengbach didn't want him hanging around with their kids. But I don't think he was a predator. He was described by Heinrich Benesch, his loyal friend and collector, and one of the many father figures who took him under their wings, as childlike. Shy, reserved, quiet, and childlike. And I wonder if he might have been on the autistic spectrum. There isn't an awful lot to support this idea. It's more of a hunch than a diagnosis. But it could help with understanding why his depictions of the human form sometimes seem to be from another world. Harder to explain, though, are the twisted, disarticulated body postures of his self-portraits. There are lots of theories linking these works to the overripe and about to disintegrate Austro-Hungarian Empire, a society described by writer Karl Kraus as an isolation cell in which one is allowed to scream. And there are other theories that his work is some kind of premonition of the horrors that were about to come later in the century. Perhaps. Or perhaps he was just fascinated by the pictures of the neurological and psychiatric disorders in the Salpêtrière iconographies. Or perhaps he was reliving the trauma of seeing his father die from neurosyphilis. We have to remember that at this time around 1/5 of male patients in asylums had general paralysis of the insane, just one of the manifestations of third-stage syphilis, beginning with vague symptoms of fatigue and headache, moving through socially disinhibited behaviour and grandiose delusions to a final phase of unclear speech, tremors, uncoordinated jerky movements, confusion, seizures, and either death from a stroke or a state of severe dementia, bedbound and oblivious to the world, all completely incurable. We can get an idea of this last phase from some archive footage of Friedrich Nietzsche, the once mighty philosopher in his final days in an asylum as an old man before his time. And we have to remember that the cause of general paralysis of the insane, or GPI, was still not fully understood. The Treponema pallidum bacterium was only discovered in 1905, and it wasn't until 1912 that Hideo Noguchi proved that GPI was caused by the same bacterium. So Schiele could not have known for certain that the cause of his father's illness was syphilis, and he could not have known whether he was destined to develop the same terrifying symptoms and suffer the same lingering death. But he would have been worried about it. For me, this is a powerful explanation of why his self-portraits are so troubled. How could they not be when he was wrestling with all of this and his own emerging sexuality, in a city that was famous for indulgence and excess. Thank you for watching. I'd be interested to hear your views on Egon Schiele. Is his work degrading or refreshingly honest? Was he as childlike as Benesch suggested, or was he a master businessman who knew exactly what the market wanted? If you want to see his work, Vienna is very much the place to go, especially the wonderful Leopold Museum, where you can really get a sense of the scale of his pictures, which just doesn't come across on a screen or in a book. But if you want to see the full range of his work, then you'll have to check out some of the books, as not all of it is on display in museums or easily accessible on the internet. As for biographies, I like this one by Frank Whitford. It's an old one, but it doesn't shy away from the more controversial aspects of his life, and I'll add it to my Amazon store page if you're interested. But apart from that, I'll say goodbye for now, and I hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.